Then the ego arises and develops as an adjunct to the id. It mediates the id because you can't always get what you want. There's some pretty serious consequences to impulsive, irrational behavior, especially when you get older, but certainly when you're a toddler and you start learning that the world will operate on you and it will tolerate certain things and it won't tolerate other things, and you have to learn to get along in that world. You have to learn to operate within those constraints. And so the ego then develops as an adjunct to the id, and it operates then on the reality principle. So what can I get realistically? And young children, as we've seen with cognitive stages of development a la Piaget, do not have the capacity to really take into account other people's perspectives, needs, wants, wishes. They're really operating on a very self-centered platform until they're old enough to develop the cognitive capacity to abstractly think about other people and hypothetically run scenarios in their mind. So the reality principle just gives you this idea that you can get some things if you engage in certain kinds of behaviors, and you will be less successful if you don't engage in those behaviors. So we have secondary process now, adaptive measures taken by the mind to assess needs and the ability to get desires fulfilled, wishes fulfilled. So you have that primal drive, and in this case, I want a cookie, but I'm maybe a little bit older, and I know that screaming and yelling doesn't get the cookie. Not only doesn't get the cookie, but I get punished on top of it, so that makes it worse. Not only don't I get what I want, I get something I don't want. So now ego starts to develop and takes these things into account. And as it's taking into account, it says, well, let me think about this for a minute. Now, the kid isn't necessarily a devious operator here, carefully assessing the situation, but responds to the environment. So go into the kitchen, we'll put a mom and dad in this scenario. Mom, can I have a cookie? No, it's almost dinner time, you can't have a cookie. Oh, okay. So not going to tantrum, not going to flip out. I'm just going to nominally agree. And then go into the other room and go, Dad, can I have a cookie? Well, stupid dad like me goes, yeah, whatever, have a cookie. So the kid doesn't run in and go, Dad said I have a cookie, ha ha, right? The reality principle and the secondary process might allow that child to assess the situation. The mom leaves to go do something, and the kid walks in now and gets the cookie. Being caught in the act of getting the cookie by the mom now says, Dad said I could have one. See, I'm not doing something wrong. I know you said I couldn't, but Dad said I could, and he's an authority too, so I took a realistic means into consideration, and now I shouldn't be in trouble because I did what I was supposed to. I asked permission, and I got the cookie because he said I could have it. But in that act of being caught, in a young child who's developed the reality principle and the secondary process, they're not a moral creature at that point from a Freudian perspective. They are amoral, right? They are without morals. They're just operating in the environment. But the moral principles that we talk about with Kohlberg and others in development are coming along. We're learning what gets punished and what gets rewarded, and ultimately we're going to internalize these ideas, and the superego starts to develop. Now, the superego is operating on the morality principle, that you should do certain things and you should not do other things. In other words, we're talking about conscience. Developing as one learns what society and others expect of their behavior and desires. Some things you can say, I really want, and other things you better not say you really want, because other people will judge you very negatively for even voicing those desires. Now, what's interesting is there's no thought you can't have. There's no behavior you couldn't engage in, no matter how repulsive it may seem to most members of society. And just thinking something doesn't make you guilty of doing something. So the idea of sinning in your heart is a moral principle idea of what you should and shouldn't do. But, if we look at conscious experience and what one's capable of thinking of, and you look at, say, a writer like Stephen King who writes about horrifying situations, people look at that and they go, oh, I didn't think that, he thought that, but they read it because it's really enjoyable, and they can gratify those really primal urges to at least think about, right, in primary process, these things which they can't even acknowledge having any thoughts of outside of having read the book. But in reading the book, they have the same thoughts that perhaps the writer had. But the writer, if that was the kind of person he was, is what he thought, then we'd have to lock him up, because obviously he's insane and he's a danger to everybody. But he's not. He's just a person comfortable having thoughts most people find repulsive, writing them down, and there's a there is a ready market for that kind of thing because they can gratify these id impulses through just reading about his accounts of things that he was thinking that were negative to most people. But the conscience then develops and says, well, you shouldn't do that. You might think it, but you better not do it. But we know that some people do things they shouldn't do. So maybe their consciences aren't fully developed. The ego ideal is what we believe we should aspire to. What would we be if we were a perfect person? Now, you can't be a perfect person, but there is, as we will see in the idea of cognitive dissonance when we get into the social psych chapters, right, this standard you hold for yourself that your behavior does not always meet. And when your standard and your behavior do not meet with one another, it causes some discomfort. Well, there's ways you can resolve the discomfort, and for Freud it would be defense mechanisms, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you have this notion of what it would be like to be a perfect person. And so we're looking at the morality principle and conscience and ego ideal, and as such, going back to our cookie episode, the id, the kid just tantrums, right? And the ego developing, the kid assesses his ability to get the cookie, succeeds in getting a cookie, thinks he succeeds, gets caught, but has an excuse. But then what happens now? Dad said I could have a cookie. And mom goes, oh no, I can't believe you would do that. You're manipulating your father. You're manipulating me. You should feel bad. I can't believe you would do that to us. You knew that you shouldn't have a cookie, and you went and found a way to have one anyway, and thus you should feel guilty. That guilt feeling then is the superego developing. Because before that, why would the kid feel guilty? They just wanted a cookie. But in this sense, the society, through the parents as agents of society, is telling the child there's certain things you should feel bad about wanting or doing. And for me, one of the easiest ways to remember how this all works is to think about that classic cartoon setup. Well, let me go here first, just to look at this. A lot of people use an iceberg as a metaphor for these concepts. The ego is the most conscious aspect of your reality. So that's what you're aware of, and it mediates, as we'll see, the id and the superego. The id is perhaps the most unconscious aspect of your personality, but there's a lot of your superego that's unconscious as well, but can become conscious. So when you have guilt feelings, you're conscious of feeling guilty. So above this line, we have conscious experience. But for Freud, these id impulses are so deep, so dark, so primal that you can't be an adult and acknowledge them in yourself, that you can't even bring them to consciousness. And so they might gain expression through dreams or through some kind of other vicarious means, like watching horrible movies or reading books that are titillating in ways that you wouldn't cop to or admit to thinking on your own. But largely you're not thinking that you have these desires. They gain expression though. And it's this conflict between the id and the superego that goes on all the time. So my little trick for remembering this is that you look at that cartoon angel and devil on the shoulder, right? You have this person who has a dilemma. Should I do this? I really want to do this, but I kind of know I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't even acknowledge wanting to do this, much less do it. And you have the devil pops up and goes, do it. You know, you should do it. Go ahead. You know you want to. You can get away with it. I think we can do this, right? And that would be the id, pushing the person towards doing something that they really want deep down. And then you got the angel that pops up and goes, oh, you can't even believe you would think this. Don't listen to him. You're so much better than that. You're not the kind of person that would even think these kinds of things, much less do them. And the head in the middle between the devil and the angel is your ego, trying to work out and negotiate the differences between the two and makes the decision consciously. Not necessarily conscious from a Freudian perspective, because they're going to do something, and whatever they wind up doing, Freud would say, was kind of predetermined by the dominance of the id or the dominance of the superego beyond consciousness. They might rationalize the choice they make, but it had more to do with the internal psychic forces. In fact, that's why they call it psychodynamic, because these forces are dynamic. And in a pressure hydraulic sense, whichever one has the greatest amount of pressure, exerts the greatest amount of pressure, is going to be the one that wins. But this is where we live in ego consciousness, and we can't allow ourselves to feel certain kinds of things because they're so devastating. And we can't operate with certain levels of guilt because they're so overwhelming that we can't feel good about ourselves. And so the ego is always striving to negotiate between these two things, these forces of a largely unconscious nature. And so with the id and the ego, id and superego, both striving to dominate, the ego is the one that mediates between them. That's the conscious experience. So for Freud, what caused mental illness, which is a topic we'll get on to at the end of the course, was caused by disharmony in these forces. They would be an overwhelming id force or an overwhelming superego force or a deficient ego to put them in check. And that was at the root of all your mental illnesses and neuroses. Now, neurosis is something we all share from a Freudian perspective. Everybody's got their hang-ups, their proclivities, their eccentricities, their things that are unique to them that they struggle with. They're issues, if you will. That's very different than psychoticism, which is a departure from reality, right, in some major way. But Freud would say we actually do depart from reality pretty regularly because our ego will simply shift our interpretations of reality to be more consistent with what we need. He says we all live with these anxieties. And the anxieties are of three major types. We have a reality anxiety, which is normal and something that we all have, where there's real threats to the environment. If I lose my job, I would then have a real anxiety about whether I'd be able to pay my rent or pay my mortgage. And that's a reality-based anxiety, that I'm going to have to deal with that problem one way or the other, consciously and proactively, hopefully. But if I did or I didn't do that consciously and proactively, then it would be these other forces operating within me that are really driving the ship, and I'm not aware of them or counting for them, and they're the ones that are making it more adaptive or less adaptive in terms of my adjustment. However, then you've got these neurotic tendencies, neurotic anxiety, where the id threatens to break through. It threatens to gain access to control of the behavior and do things that one would later be either punished for if caught or ashamed of if they carried out. And so having this worry about certain desires being inappropriate and then breaking through is a neurotic anxiety. Now, if they do break through in a consistent way, if somebody is completely dominated by their id, well, then that's the kind of person you would find from a Freudian point of view. And I always point out these are Freud's ideas, not Doula's ideas. So bear with me. Then that's who's in prison. Right? These people who we see in prison are breaking laws compulsively, impulsively, regularly. Not everybody, of course. Everybody has variations. But if you see somebody who's habitually locked up time and again, from a Freudian point of view, what's happening is their id is dominating. They're always gratifying their most basic and primal needs without regard for society's standards. The flip side of that is moral anxiety, where somebody is so dominated by their superego that they feel small, unworthy, and guilt-ridden all the time. So it's a very negative experience because you can't possibly be the perfect person. You'll always fall short, but because the superego is so strong in the person that they always feel unworthy, guilty, and ashamed. And that's going to lead to depression and anxiety and other kinds of negative outcomes because, from a Freudian point of view, they have this massive superego dominance that's putting the ego at risk for feeling bad consciously a lot of the time. But it's probably going to keep the id in check. There won't be much expression, if any expression, of id wants or needs.